What if the Soviet Union had built the internet before the West? Not a military intranet, a full nationwide network connecting every factory, every farm, every government office from Vladivostok to Leningrad, real-time data, automated planning, a connected economy running decades before the World Wide Web. The Cold War ends differently. The 20th century ends differently. Everything is different. This almost happened. And one man spent his career trying to make it real. His name was Viktor Glushkov. He was a Soviet mathematician and computer scientist, and in the 1960s and 70s he proposed something called OGAS, the All-State Automated System, a nationwide computer network that, if it had been built, would have predated what we know as the Internet by roughly 2 decades. Glushkov didn't fail because his idea was flawed. He failed because the idea worked, and the people with the most to lose from it made sure it never got built. That pattern, visionary technology buried by institutional fear, is not ancient history. It is happening right now. That's why this story matters. Viktor Glushkov was not some rogue dissident sketching blueprints in a gulag. He was the establishment. Director of the Institute of Cybernetics in Kiev, recipient of the Lenin Prize, the highest honor the Soviet state gave to scientists. A man trusted by the system, decorated by the system. He believed in the Soviet project. He just believed it was going to fail if it didn't modernize. By the mid-1960s, the Soviet planned economy had developed a structural crisis that had nothing to do with ideology. The problem was information. Central planning, the system that set prices, allocated resources, and coordinated production across 1/6 of the Earth's land surface, ran on paper. Gosplan, the central planning agency in Moscow, processed millions of documents every year. Decisions that should have taken days took months. Data that should have been precise arrived distorted, delayed, or not at all. Glushkov did the math. He estimated that by the 1980s, maintaining the Soviet bureaucracy at its current growth rate would require the entire adult population of the USSR just to push paper. The system would collapse under its own administrative weight before any external enemy brought it down. He believed computers were the answer, and he was going to prove it. OGAS stood for Общегосударственная Автоматизированная Система, the all-state automated system, and the scope of it is genuinely breathtaking, even by modern standards. The design called for a 3-tiered computer network. At the national level, a central computing facility in Moscow. Below it, roughly 200 regional computing centers spread across the republics. Below those, around 20,000 terminals located in individual factories, collective farms, and government offices across the entire country. All of them connected. All of them exchanging data in real time. The goal wasn't just to digitize the paperwork, it was to transform how the economy was managed. Supply shortages would be visible immediately. Production data from a factory in Novosibirsk would feed automatically into national planning models. Prices could be updated to reflect real conditions rather than 5-year-old assumptions. The plan would stop being a document drafted in ignorance and start being a living system responding to reality. Glushkov began pushing this vision in the early 1960s. He spent years refining the architecture, lobbying Soviet leadership, building coalitions. By the early 1970s, he had a detailed implementation proposal and genuine momentum. In terms of network design, what he was proposing was conceptually comparable to, and in some respects ahead of, what ARPANET was doing in the United States at the same time. The difference is that ARPANET got built. Here's where the story turns into something colder. Because OGAS didn't just threaten the status quo in the abstract, it threatened specific, powerful people. And they knew it. The Soviet military was the first front of opposition. The military ran its own computing infrastructure, its own closed networks for command and control. The idea of a nationwide civilian network, one overseen by a government agency, raised immediate concerns. Who controlled the data flowing through this system? Could military communications be exposed or intercepted? The generals didn't need convincing that OGAS was dangerous. They were certain of it. The KGB had a more complicated position. A national information network could be a surveillance dream. Everything recorded, tracked, visible. But it also created a problem. OGAS, as Glushkov designed it, was meant to reduce the role of human intermediaries in economic decisions. Real-time data and automated recommendations would bypass the local party officials who currently held enormous discretionary power. Less discretion for officials meant less leverage for the security apparatus that depended on those officials. The KGB saw OGAS as something that could, over time, erode exactly the kind of information asymmetry that made Soviet power work. And then there was the finance ministry, whose objection was simpler and in some ways most effective: money. Glushkov's estimates put the construction cost in the range of 20 billion rubles, one of the largest infrastructure investments in Soviet history. The finance ministry controlled that kind of budget authorization. They had no interest in approving a project that would cost that much, take years to build, and, if it succeeded, hand enormous influence to someone other than them. 3 power centers: military, security, finance, all with different reasons to oppose OGAS, all with enough institutional weight to stop it. The death of OGAS was not a dramatic execution. There was no show trial, no famous moment of rejection. It was bureaucratic attrition. Approvals were delayed. Pilot projects were underfunded. The scope was quietly reduced. Political allies who had supported Glushkov found themselves reassigned to other priorities. At each stage, there was always a reasonable-sounding justification. The cost needs more review. The timeline needs adjustment. The technical specifications need another committee. None of it was technically a no. All of it was functionally a death sentence. Glushkov spent the 1970s in this purgatory, revising, resubmitting, negotiating. By the late 1970s, the project existed in name only. The network was never built. He died in January 1982 at 58 years old. The dream died with him. The USSR struggled on without an information system capable of managing its complexity. The paperwork problem Glushkov had diagnosed got worse. A decade after his death, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. The standard reading of this story is, "Soviet bureaucracy kills good idea." And that's accurate as far as it goes, but I think it misses the deeper pattern. OGAS wasn't rejected because it was technically unproven. It was rejected because it worked, and because the people who would have had to give up power to make it work chose not to. This is not a uniquely Soviet failure, it's a structural one. Transformative technology doesn't fail because it doesn't solve real problems. It fails because solving real problems always means redistributing how problems get solved. And that means redistributing power. The military, the KGB, the finance ministry weren't being irrational. They were being rational from where they sat. Now look at 2026. Every major AI system being deployed today is, underneath the technical surface, a governance architecture. It changes who has access to information, who makes recommendations, who gets to be the trusted intermediary. The same dynamics that killed OGAS are running now. Inside corporations debating whether AI should replace their middle managers, inside governments negotiating what AI can and cannot automate, inside bureaucracies that understand completely what is at stake. The institutions that will resist AI most effectively are not the ones that don't understand it. They're the ones that understand it exactly right. Glushkov's mistake, if you can call it that, was thinking he was solving a technical problem when he was actually fighting a political one. Knowing the difference doesn't guarantee you win, but not knowing it guarantees you lose. Viktor Glushkov had the vision, the mathematical tools, and the institutional credibility to build something that could have reshaped the 20th century. What he didn't have was a way to overcome the people who would lose the most from his success. The Soviet internet died in committee. The question worth sitting with, right now in 2026, is which technologies alive today are heading down the same road. If this kind of story is what you're here for, subscribe. Next time, we're looking at another idea that was buried before the world was ready for it.